I remember the exact temperature of the air in my quarters before it happened. 21 degrees Celsius, standard ship atmosphere. I had been tallying supply requisitions for the portside armory decks, my stylus scratching against data slate glass, in the particular rhythm I had developed over 6 years of service aboard the Undying Conviction. The ship was a Lunar-class cruiser, 8,000 souls distributed across 5 kilometers of corridor and chamber, and I was Supply Officer 3rd Class Matthias Kane. That name still meant something then. It identified me as distinct from the 7,999 others who breathed the same recycled air. My mother's face exists in my memory as archive now, not as living recollection. I access the file sometimes. Brown hair, scar across her left cheekbone from industrial accident on the manufacturing floor, where she spent 43 years. She told me the day I received conscription papers that service on an Imperial vessel was honor. I believed her because I was 17 and had never left the hive. The last thing she said, I have replayed this fragment of data 8,412 times since, was that the Emperor protects those who serve faithfully. The Undying Conviction made warp translations every 40 to 60 days, depending on navigator calculations and route requirements. This was my 19th transit. Procedure was established and routine. All non-essential personnel confined to quarters. Gellar field generators brought to full operational capacity 6 hours before translation. Sanctified oils applied to generator housings by the tech priests who maintained them. Prayers transmitted through ship-wide Vox system. The litanies lasted 40 minutes, and I knew them by heart, though I cannot say whether I believed the words or simply found comfort in their repetition. I had learned certain things about warp travel that were not included in official crew briefings. You learned them from the old hands, the men who had survived a dozen transits or more. You learned that approximately 1 in every 8 translations resulted in casualty, usually minor. A crewman would experience psychological break, begin screaming about things crawling in the walls, and would require restraint and sedation. Sometimes the number was higher. 2 transits before this one, 14 crew had died when a maintenance corridor depressurized during the crossing. The official report attributed it to material fatigue and hull plating. The unofficial word, passed through whispers in the meal halls, was that something had been chewing at the metal from outside. You learned not to look directly at reflective surfaces during transit. The distortions in glass and polished metal were dismissed as optical phenomena caused by field interaction. But the distortions sometimes had shapes that your mind insisted were faces. You learned not to listen too carefully to the ambient ship sounds. The usual vibration of plasma drives and life support systems acquired additional frequencies during warp travel. Tones that seemed almost like voices, almost like words in languages that hurt to hear. Most importantly, you learned that the Gellar field was the only barrier between our reality and something else. The tech priests called it the Imperium. The navigators, when they spoke at all, called it the Sea of Souls. The older crew called it Hell and refused further elaboration. I was in my quarters reviewing supply data when translation began. The familiar shudder ran through deck plating. My stylus skipped across the data slate screen, leaving a diagonal mark through 3 columns of ordnance figures. I set it aside and gripped the edges of my bunk as the sensation intensified. It felt like falling and rising simultaneously. My inner ear reported motion in 6 directions at once. I closed my eyes and waited for it to pass. It always passed. This time it did not pass. 14 seconds into translation, the lighting changed. The standard white illumination from overhead lumens shifted to red emergency lighting. This was not unusual. Power fluctuations during the translation process sometimes triggered automatic safety protocols. I kept my eyes closed and continued waiting. Then the temperature changed. It dropped 7 degrees in approximately 2 seconds. My breath misted in front of my face. I opened my eyes because the cold was wrong, was not consistent with any mechanical failure I had been trained to recognize. The red emergency lighting flickered. In the gaps between flickers, I saw that the walls of my quarters were moving. I want to be precise about this, because precision is all I have left. The walls themselves were not moving. The material, standard Imperial Navy bulkhead construction, reinforced playsteel with soundproofing composite, remained stationary, but something underneath the walls was moving. I could see it the way you can see someone walking behind a thin curtain, shapes pressed outward against the metal. They had no consistent form. A bulge would appear, travel laterally for half a meter, then sink back into flatness. Another would emerge somewhere else. They reminded me of hands pressing against fabric, but the proportions were wrong. Too many fingers. Fingers that bent in too many directions. The Vox system activated. Klaxons began screaming their standard breach alert pattern. Then a voice cut through. Lieutenant Horvath, 4th Deck Watch Commander, and I knew him because we had shared meal rotation for 2 years. His voice was not steady. The words came too fast, compressed together as though he could not breathe properly between them. Gellar field fluctuation, all decks field integrity at. Static consumed whatever percentage he had been about to report. When his voice returned, it was higher. Seal your quarters, seal everything, do not open, do not. The transmission ended. The klaxons continued. I moved toward my door to engage manual lock, and that was when I heard the screaming begin. It came from multiple directions simultaneously. My quarters were located in officer territory, 3rd Deck, Section 12. Approximately 80 personnel quartered within 50 meters of my position. The walls of officer quarters were thicker than standard crew compartments, sound-insulated to provide minimal privacy. But the screaming cut through as though the walls were not present. It was not the screaming of pain. I had heard that before, during training accidents and equipment malfunctions. This was different. The screaming contained a quality that bypassed rational processing and triggered something primitive in my brain. Something that existed before language told me to be afraid. I sealed my door. The manual lock engaged with the solid mechanical thunk that indicated successful coupling. I backed away from it and tried to access logical thought. The Gellar field had fluctuated. This was serious but not unprecedented. The field would be restored. The tech priests would recalibrate the generators. We would emerge from warp translation with casualties, but the ship would survive. The ship always survived. The temperature continued dropping, 5 degrees 7. My breath came in clouds now. I could see frost forming on the interior surfaces of my quarters. It spread in patterns that were too regular to be natural. The frost grew in spirals and geometric designs that hurt to follow with my eyes. I looked away from them and focused on the door. Something hit the door from outside. The impact registered as deep metallic boom that I felt through the deck plating. Then another impact. Then scratching sounds, metal on metal, except metal does not scratch that way, does not produce sounds that fluctuate in pitch and rhythm like speech, like laughter. I had been issued a standard pattern las pistol as part of my officer kit. It was in the storage locker beneath my bunk. I retrieved it with hands that shook badly enough that I dropped it once before managing to grip properly. I charged the power cell. The activation light showed green. I aimed at the door and waited. The scratching continued for 37 seconds, then stopped. The silence was worse. I stood in my quarters holding a las pistol aimed at a sealed door while the temperature dropped to freezing and the frost patterns continued spreading across every surface. The screaming elsewhere in the ship had not stopped. It had multiplied, hundreds of voices now, maybe thousands. I could not distinguish individual sources anymore. It had become a single continuous sound, a frequency that seemed to vibrate in my teeth and sternum. Then I heard Davros. His voice came from the ventilation grating near the ceiling. That was impossible, because the ventilation system was a closed loop of ducts 20 centimeters in diameter. Nothing human-sized could transit them. But I heard him clearly, his voice with the slight accent from his homeworld that I had learned to recognize over 3 years of service together. Matthias. Matthias, you have to let me in, please. It's right behind me. Matthias. I can hear it breathing. Matthias, please. The door. Open the door. Davros was Supply Officer Second Class, my direct superior. We had worked together on every shift for 3 years. I knew his voice. This was his voice. But the words came from the ventilation grating, and that meant something else was using his voice, or he was somehow inside the ventilation system. And both possibilities were wrong enough that my hands tightened on the last pistol until the grip cut into my palms. Matthias, it's cold in here. It's so cold. I can't feel my fingers anymore. It's right behind me. I can hear it breathing. Matthias, your mother. Your mother says to open the door. She says you should have listened. She says the Emperor doesn't protect faithless sons. I did not open the door. The voice stopped. The silence returned for approximately 15 seconds. Then every reflective surface in my quarters began showing me things. The data slate screen, the polished surface of my footlocker, the small mirror I used for grooming, even the glossed paint on certain wall sections. They all became windows into somewhere else. I saw corridors filled with things that moved wrong, that had too many limbs arranged in configurations that did not match any anatomy I could recognize. I saw crew members running. I saw crew members standing perfectly still, with expressions of such joy on their faces that it looked like agony. I saw things wearing crew uniforms like poorly fitted clothes, the fabric bulging in places where nothing should bulge. I saw Davros. He was in one of the main transit corridors, third deck, judging by the identification markings visible on the bulkhead behind him. He was on his knees. There was something behind him. I could not look at it directly. My eyes refused to focus on its shape. It was large. It had parts that might have been arms. It was doing something to Davros that I cannot describe, because the memory file is corrupted, or perhaps I corrupted it deliberately, deleted the data rather than continue processing it. What I remember clearly is that Davros was screaming, but his mouth was smiling. The expression on his face showed transcendent happiness, while sounds of absolute terror came from his throat. This lasted for 11 seconds. Then the thing behind him finished what it was doing, and Davros stopped being Davros. What remained stood up. It looked at me through the data slate screen. It saw me. I know it saw me because it waved. I shot the data slate. The last bolt punched through the screen and into the wall behind it. The small explosion of superheated plastic and metal created smoke that smelled like burning insulation. I shot the mirror. I shot the footlocker surface. I shot every reflective object in my quarters until the power cell depleted to 12% and the warning light activated. The screaming throughout the ship reached a crescendo and then stopped. All of it, simultaneously. Thousands of voices cutting to silence between 1 second and the next. The temperature began rising. The frost patterns on the walls sublimated into vapor that smelled like copper and ozone. The red emergency lighting flickered 3 times and returned to standard white illumination. The Vox system crackled, and a new voice transmitted, Commissar Voigt, Senior Discipline Officer, and his voice carried the absolute authority that commissars cultivated as a central tool. All personnel. The Gellar field has been restored to full integrity. Remain in your quarters. Do not emerge for any reason. Armsmen are conducting security sweeps. Any personnel found in corridors without authorization will be assumed compromised and terminated immediately. Remain in your quarters. This situation is contained. I remained in my quarters. I sat on my bunk holding a last pistol with 12% charge remaining and stared at the door. I did not trust that the situation was contained. I did not trust that the door would hold. I did not trust the silence. Hours passed. I counted them by the chronometer function on my wall display, which had somehow survived my shooting spree. 6 hours, 8, 12. No one came to my door. No announcements came through the Vox beyond periodic repetition of Commissar Voigt's order to remain quartered. At the 14-hour mark, I heard las gun fire. Multiple weapons, sustained firing pattern consistent with armsmen conducting hostile engagement. The firing came from somewhere above my position, 4th or 5th deck. It lasted 90 seconds, then stopped. No announcements followed. At the 16-hour mark, my door chimed. The visitor alert system activated as though someone had pressed the request buzzer in standard procedure, as though this were a normal visit during normal circumstances. The display showed exterior camera feed. 2 armsmen stood outside my door in full carapace armor, with lasguns held ready. Behind them was someone in administratum robes. "Supply Officer 3rd Class Kane," the robed figure said, voice transmitted through door speaker. "You are ordered to unseal and admit inspection team. Non-compliance will be interpreted as evidence of compromise." I unsealed the door. The armsmen entered first, weapons trained on me until they confirmed I was alone and showed no obvious signs of mutation or possession. The administratum official followed. He was young, perhaps 25, with a pale complexion of someone who spent their entire life in artificial light. He carried a data slate and a device I did not recognize, a handheld unit with multiple sensor arrays that swept across my quarters, registering data I could not interpret. "Weapon," one armsman said. I surrendered the las pistol. The administratum official completed his scan and noted results on his data slate. "Quarters show evidence of discharge. Explain." I explained. "Reflective surfaces. Things that should not be visible. Preemptive elimination of potential threat vectors." He recorded my statement without expression. "You heard your superior officer's voice? I heard something using his voice. You did not open the door?" "No. You did not attempt to render assistance to any crew member during the incident. I remained sealed as ordered." He made additional notes. "Supply Officer 2nd Class Davros is confirmed deceased. Preliminary sweep recovered remains from 3rd deck transit corridor. You are assigned temporary 2nd Class duties pending command review." I processed this information. Davros was dead. I had watched something kill him through a data slate screen. Now I would perform his duties. This seemed like grotesque elevation, but I did not speak this observation. "Current casualty figures," I said. It was not quite a question. The administratum official consulted his data slate. 417 confirmed deceased. Additional 193 quarantined pending evaluation. Gellar experienced 8.3-second failure during warp translation. Failure has been classified as acceptable loss parameter for vessel this classification. 417 dead, 8 seconds. Approximately 50 deaths per second. This was acceptable. "You are cleared for duty resumption," the official continued. "Report to supply coordination at 0600. Replacement personnel requisitions require immediate processing." The armsman withdrew. The official withdrew. My door remained unsealed. I stood in quarters that smelled like burned plastic and copper, and I tried to understand what acceptable loss parameter meant. I attempted to sleep, but could not. When I closed my eyes, I saw Davros smiling while he screamed. I saw the thing behind him that I could not properly perceive. I saw its wave, the gesture of something wearing humanity-like costume, greeting me through glass and madness. At 0600, I reported to supply coordination. The department had lost 6 personnel. Davros, 3 clerks, 2 deck supervisors. Their workstations stood empty, their data slates still logged in, their final entries incomplete. Someone had placed white cloths over their chairs. This was not official protocol. Someone had done it anyway. I assumed Davros's station and accessed his files. The last entry was a supply request for Gellar field generator components. He had been processing it when the field failed. The timestamp showed he had been working 11 minutes into the translation, 11 minutes before everything went wrong. He had been performing his duty right until the moment something pulled him into the corridor and unmade him while his face smiled. I completed his request. I submitted it through proper channels. I began processing the next item in queue. This was how I learned to continue. The ship emerged from warp translation 19 hours after the incident began. We translated into real space 12 light-years from our destination, a standard deviation within acceptable parameters. The navigator had guided us through despite the field failure. I learned later that the navigator had sealed himself in his sanctum and had not emerged even after we reached real space. When they finally opened the chamber 4 days later, they found him alive but catatonic. He never spoke again. They transported him to some facility where the Navi's Nobilite processed their damaged personnel. We received a replacement navigator 17 days later. The casualty count rose as evaluations continued. The 193 quarantine personnel underwent examination by Medicaid teams and commissariat interrogators. They used protocols I was not privy to. I only saw results. 53 were returned to duty after psychological evaluation and penance rituals. They received reassignment to different sections, never returning to their original posts. I would see some of them occasionally in the corridors. They walked with particular care, keeping their eyes fixed forward, never making contact with others. The remaining 140 were not returned to duty. I learned what happened to them through Sergeant Kellner, Armsman 3rd Squad, who I encountered during the supply delivery to Security Armory. He helped me load replacement power cells into storage racks while we talked, and his hands moved with the automatic precision of someone performing familiar task while their mind processed other things. "They're not dead," he said. "That's the problem. If they were dead, we could process them and be done. But they're not dead. They're talking, moving, following orders mostly. But they're not right." "Not right," I repeated. One of them, crewman Hestor, engineering, he was normal for 3 days. Evaluated clean. Then on day 4, he starts laughing during morning prayer. Couldn't stop. Laughed for 6 hours straight until his throat ruptured. Still alive. Still laughing, just quieter. Kellner secured a power cell into its charging cradle with more force than necessary. Another one, she passed every test. Clean genetic scan, clean psychological baseline, clean spiritual evaluation. Then someone noticed she cast shadows wrong. Like her shadow didn't match where the light sources were. How do you even test for that? What happened to them? Kellner did not answer immediately. He finished loading the power cells and stood facing the armory wall for several seconds. Commissar gave the order. Termination protocols. We did it quietly. Night rotation. Processed them in groups of 10. They didn't resist. Most of them seemed grateful. A few were crying. Not sad crying. Happy crying. Like we were giving them something they wanted. He turned to face me and his expression showed nothing. I pulled trigger on 14 of them personally. 14 las bolts, 14 bodies. Logged each one. Standard procedure for compromised personnel, acceptable loss parameter. He left before I could respond. The phrase haunted me. Acceptable loss parameter. It appeared in every official report generated after the incident. The Gellar field failure had lasted 8.3 seconds and resulted in acceptable losses. This meant the failure duration fell within projected statistical ranges for vessels of this classification. This meant we had lost fewer than 600 crew. This meant the ship remained operational. This meant the Imperium's business continued uninterrupted. I began researching historical data accessible through my increased clearance as Acting Supply Officer Second Class. The undying conviction had served for 173 years. Crew complement of 8,000 was maintained through regular recruitment and replacement. The ship had experienced 47 documented Gellar field failures during its service history, ranging from 0.5 seconds to 21 seconds. Average casualty rate per incident was 436 souls. Total casualties from field failures, 20,492. Total number of personnel who had served aboard the ship across 173 years, approximately 94,000. 21% casualty rate attributable to warp-related incidents, not including standard combat losses, accidents, or natural attrition. The ship consumed its crew. It consumed them systematically, statistically, inevitably. Every warp translation carried probability of failure. Every failure consumed souls. New crew arrived. The cycle repeated. The ship continued. I am not sure when I stopped thinking of myself as Matthias Kane. The process was gradual. My duties consumed my time. As acting second class, I managed supply coordination for the entire vessel. I processed requisitions. I tracked inventory. I calculated consumption rates and projected needs. I worked 16-hour shifts and slept when exhaustion forced me to cease functioning. When I slept, I dreamed. The dreams were consistent. I was in the corridor outside my quarters during the 8 seconds when the field failed. I could move freely. I watched what happened. I saw crew members pulled through walls that had become permeable. I saw things that wore human shapes badly reaching through doorways. I saw Davros in the moment before the thing took him. In the dreams, I could reach him. I could pull him back. I could change the outcome, but I never did. In the dreams, I stood and watched while my hands remained at my sides, and Davros smiled and screamed and became something else. Then the thing that had been Davros would turn and see me and wave, and I would wake up counting my fingers to make sure I still had the correct number. 3 months after the incident, I was confirmed as Permanent Supply Officer Second Class. The promotion came with expanded quarters, increased meal rations, and clearance to access restricted sections when supply duties required. I accepted these benefits without particular emotion. They were logistical improvements to my operational capacity, nothing more. 4 months after the incident, we conducted another warp translation. Procedure was identical: 6 hours preparation, generator sanctification, crew confinement, prayer transmission. I remained sealed in my quarters, my new larger quarters, and waited. The familiar shudder came, the sensation of impossible motion. I gripped my bunk and counted seconds. The translation completed without incident. 0 casualties. The Gellar field maintained integrity throughout the crossing. We emerged at our destination with no losses. I felt relief for approximately 7 seconds. Then I processed the mathematical reality. No casualties this translation. 417 casualties last translation. Average casualty rate per translation, 208 souls. The absence of loss this time meant nothing except that probability had distributed favorably on this occasion. Next translation might kill 800, might kill 8,000. The field might fail for 20 seconds instead of 8. The statistics accumulated without regard for individual translations. We were always losing. The timing was simply variable. I began noticing patterns among the crew. Specifically, I noticed how veterans behaved differently than recruits. The recruits showed normal fear before translations. They gripped things tightly. They prayed with genuine desperation. They believed the prayers mattered. The veterans performed the prayers but showed no emotional investment. They gripped their bunks, but their expressions remained neutral. They had learned what the recruits would eventually learn or die before learning. Fear changed nothing. Prayer changed nothing. The ship would consume who it consumed. You either survived or you did not. Emotional investment in the outcome was inefficient allocation of psychological resources. I was becoming a veteran. I met Konstantin 6 months after the Gellar field incident. He arrived as part of a replacement contingent, 300 new crew recruited to fill losses from the incident and from normal attrition. He was assigned to supply coordination as clerk 3rd class. 19 years old, brown hair cut to regulation length, scar on his right hand from childhood injury on his homeworld. He told me about the scar during his first shift while we processed ordnance requests together. Manufacturum accident, he said. I was 8, reached for something I shouldn't have reached for, saw my mother do this exact same work for 20 years, and thought I understood it. I didn't understand it. He smiled slightly. The expression looked practiced, like he had learned to deploy it in specific social contexts. She pulled my hand out before I lost more than some skin. told me the Omnissiah protects the respectful but punishes the careless. I've been respectful ever since. I assigned him to inventory tracking. Simple work, necessary work, he performed adequately. I did not plan to notice him specifically. The supply coordination department processed dozens of clerks. They arrived, performed their duties, and either advanced to other positions or died or transferred to different vessels. I logged their service and did not maintain emotional investment. But Constantine asked questions. Most recruits asked procedural questions. How do I access this system? What is the protocol for this situation? Constantine asked different questions. He asked why certain supplies were requisitioned in specific quantities. He asked about discrepancies between projected consumption rates and actual usage. He asked about historical patterns in supply failures and how they correlated with warp translations. He asked intelligent questions. This was unusual enough that I began answering in detail rather than providing minimal procedural responses. Our conversations extended beyond necessary communication. This was inefficient. I continued anyway. 2 months into his service, we conducted another warp translation. 32 casualties. Acceptable loss parameter. Constantine was not among them. I discovered I had been afraid he would be. I had been counting seconds during the translation and performing probability calculations in my head. 300 crew in his section, 32 casualties, 10.6% loss rate. I had been afraid he would be part of the 10.6%. This was dangerous. This was attachment forming in patterns similar to normal human social bonding. This was emotional investment in outcome. This was inefficient. I did not stop it. Constantine became the person I spoke to when speech was not required by duty. This happened gradually over the course of 8 months. We would process requisitions together, and he would observe patterns I had stopped noticing because familiarity had rendered them invisible. He noticed that medical supplies spiked in specific cycles. He noticed that certain weapons components degraded faster than manufacturer specifications suggested. He noticed that crew ration consumption decreased by measurable percentage in the week following warp translations. "They're not eating," he said, reviewing the data on his data slate. "Or they're eating less. Stress response, probably. Fear suppresses appetite." He looked at me with expression that contained genuine curiosity rather than rhetorical observation. "Do you eat less after translations?" I accessed memory and realized I did not know. I ate when duty schedule permitted. I consumed the rations provided. I had not tracked whether quantity varied based on circumstance. "I don't remember," I said. "You don't remember if you're hungry." I remember performing the function of eating. The subjective experience of hunger is not data I've been logging. Constantine studied me for several seconds with expression I could not interpret. Then he returned his attention to his data slate and continued working. But something in his posture had changed. A subtle tension in his shoulders, a care in how he selected his next words. "How many translations have you survived?" he asked. 23. "That's a lot. Average crew survives 7 translations before death or transfer. I am above average. 23 times you've sat in your quarters while the ship goes through hell. 23 times you've waited to find out if something comes through the walls." His voice remained level, but his hands had stopped moving across the data slate. "Do you still get afraid?" I considered the question. Fear was emotional response to perceived threat. During translations, I experienced elevated heart rate, increased respiratory rhythm, heightened sensory awareness. These were physiological responses consistent with fear state. But the subjective experience, the feeling that recruits described as terror consuming their thoughts, I could not locate that in my recent memories. "I register the appropriate biological responses," I said. "Whether this constitutes fear as you're defining it, I cannot confirm." Constantine set down his data slate. "Matthias, that's the most horrifying thing I've heard since I came aboard." The use of my first name was notable. We typically maintained rank distinction in address, but more notable was his assessment. He found my statement horrifying. Not the warp translations, not the casualties, not the things that came through when the field failed. My description of my own psychological state was what disturbed him. The alternative is to maintain continuous fear response, I said. This would degrade performance efficiency and provide no protective benefit. Adaptation is survival mechanism. Adaptation, he repeated. Is that what we're calling it? He resumed work without waiting for answer. The conversation ended, but I continued processing it for the remainder of the shift. Constantine was disturbed by evidence that I had changed from baseline human emotional response pattern. This meant he still operated closer to that baseline. This meant he was vulnerable in ways I had learned to protect against. This meant he would suffer more than necessary. I wanted to explain this to him. I wanted to help him adapt faster, to develop the protective detachment that permitted continued function. But I could not articulate how to deliberately erode one's own emotional capacity. The process had happened to me through accumulated trauma and time. I did not know how to accelerate it for someone else, and I was not certain I should want to. Over the following months, Constantine became the exception to my increasing detachment. I noticed things about him that I had stopped noticing about others. The particular rhythm of his footsteps in the corridor. The way he tilted his head slightly left when reading difficult data. The fact that he still prayed with what appeared to be genuine investment before translations. He talked about his mother frequently. She had worked supply coordination on a forge world, managing material flow for a manufacturer that produced lasgun components. He had learned the trade from her, learned to see patterns in consumption and projection, learned to treat logistics as essential art rather than simple accounting. She used to say that every number represented someone. He told me during a night shift when crew rotation left us alone in the supply coordination chamber. Every requisition for rations was someone eating. Every medical supply was someone bleeding. Every body bag was someone dying. She said if you forget that, you become the machine instead of the person operating it. Efficient philosophy for maintaining empathy, I said. Potentially detrimental for maintaining psychological stability in high-casualty environments. You think she was wrong? I think she worked on a forge world where casualty rates were predictable and localized. Ship service presents different variables. The numbers are larger. The deaths are more frequent. Maintaining individual significance for each casualty is not sustainable. Constantine was quiet for duration of 37 seconds. Then, when did you stop seeing people in the numbers? I could not identify the specific transition point. There had been no single moment of change. It had been gradual erosion, each casualty report requiring slightly less processing time, each name becoming slightly more abstract, until the tally of dead produced the same cognitive response as tallying ammunition expenditure. I don't remember, I said. And then, because he deserved more complete answer, somewhere between translation 7 and translation 15, the specific timing is not archived. I don't want that to happen to me. The alternative is worse. How do you know? I did not have answer that would satisfy him. How do you explain to someone that grief for every death would break them? That you had watched recruits shatter under the accumulated weight of caring too much? That the veterans survived precisely because they had learned to stop investing emotional significance in outcomes they could not control? You could not explain this. They had to learn it themselves, or they died before learning it, and either way the result served the ship's continuation. We conducted another warp translation 4 days later. 17 casualties. Acceptable loss parameter. Constantine survived. I logged the relief I felt as notable deviation from an established pattern of emotional detachment. This deviation concerned me. Attachment created vulnerability. Vulnerability created suffering. I should have requested his transfer to a different department. I did not request his transfer. Instead, I began teaching him things that were not part of standard procedure. I taught him which tech priests to approach for priority requests and which ones would delay requisitions behind ritual requirements. I taught him how to identify consumption patterns that indicated morale problems in specific sections. I taught him how to process casualty reports efficiently, how to extract necessary data without dwelling on names and causes of death. I was teaching him how to adapt, how to protect himself by becoming slightly less human. I told myself this was necessary. I told myself I was improving his survival probability. I was making him more like me. I understood this. I continued anyway. 14 months after Constantine's arrival, the ship received orders for extended patrol in sector designated Zone Mortis. The designation was not official Imperial nomenclature. It was veteran slang. Zones earned that name when warp space in the region demonstrated higher than average field failure rates. Zone Mortis had produced 17 complete vessel losses over the past 30 years. Our patrol would require 8 translations through the zone over a period of 4 months. The announcement produced notable psychological impact on crew. Recruit suicide rate increased by 37% in the week following the briefing. Veteran crew showed no significant deviation in behavior. They had learned that fear changed nothing. We would transit Zone Mortis because orders required it. This changed nothing about our response. We would still seal ourselves in quarters. We would still pray. We would still survive or not survive according to mathematics we could not influence. Constantine reacted differently than I expected. He became more present, more focused. He worked longer shifts without complaint. He organized supply distribution with particular care, ensuring that every section had adequate emergency medical supplies and ration reserves. He updated contingency protocols for rapid replacement requisitions in case of mass casualty. He prepared as though preparation mattered. "You're working 16-hour shifts," I observed during the 3rd day of this pattern. "This is not sustainable." "If the field fails for 15 seconds instead of 8, how many die?" he asked, without looking up from his data slate. I had run the projections. Estimated range between 900 and 1,500, depending on failure location and demon manifestation patterns. If the trauma teams can't access what they need fast enough, additional casualties in the 50 to 200 range, depending on variables. Then I'm making sure the supplies are positioned correctly. 50 lives is worth 16-hour shifts. This was the philosophy his mother had taught him. Every number was someone. He was trying to reduce the numbers through logistical optimization. He believed his effort mattered. This was simultaneously admirable and heartbreaking, because I knew what he had not yet learned. The ship would consume who it consumed. Perfect supply distribution might save 50 lives. But the next translation might kill 800 in sections where no supply preparation mattered because the crew would die instantly when daemons manifested directly into sealed chambers. But I did not say this. I helped him instead. We worked together to optimize supply distribution across all decks. We positioned emergency caches in strategic locations. We prepared detailed response protocols. We did everything that procedure and logistics allowed. We pretended it would be enough. The first translation into Zone Mortis lasted 12 seconds of field failure. 371 casualties, acceptable loss parameter for extended duration. Constantine's preparation had functioned as intended. Medical response teams reported adequate supply availability. Perhaps his optimization had saved lives. Perhaps it had saved no one, and the death toll was simply favorable probability distribution. We could not know. Constantine processed the casualty reports with visible effort. He read each name. He noted their sections and duties. He cross-referenced against supply distribution to determine if logistical factors had contributed to any deaths. This took him 6 hours longer than my method of statistical extraction would have required. "You're making it harder on yourself," I told him. "They deserve to be more than numbers. They're dead. They don't receive the benefit of your suffering on their behalf." He looked at me with expression that contained disappointment. "When did you forget how to care?" "When caring became more painful than forgetting." "I don't want to become that. You will, or you'll break. These are the available options." He returned to his reports without responding. But I noticed that his hands shook slightly as he scrolled through the names. 371 names. He was reading every one. He was performing individual recognition for every casualty. This was not sustainable. This would destroy him eventually. I wanted to protect him from this. I wanted to teach him detachment before the accumulated weight broke something essential inside him. But I also recognized that what made Constantine significant to me was precisely his refusal to adapt as I had adapted. He remained human in ways I had filed into archive and marked as inaccessible. Watching him maintain that humanity hurt, but it also reminded me that the capacity had existed in me once. I was using him as external reference point for qualities I had lost. This was selfish. This was using another person as mirror to view my own degradation. I should have stopped. I did not stop. We conducted the second zone mortis translation 22 days later. 8.9-second field failure. 403 casualties. Constantine processed every name again. His hands shook more noticeably. He worked 18-hour shifts to complete the documentation and maintain supply coordination simultaneously. I observed his deterioration with concern that I recognized his care, which was dangerous, which I could not prevent. "You need to sleep," I told him after watching him nearly collapse during requisition processing. "I need to finish the casualty reports. I can finish them. My method is faster. Your method doesn't see them as people. My method allows continued function. Your method is destroying you. Then I'll be destroyed. At least I'll go down knowing I didn't stop caring." This was martyr philosophy. This was choosing suffering as demonstration of virtue. This was inefficient and self-destructive, and I hated watching it happen to him. "Constantine, listen to me." I moved to stand directly in front of him, forcing him to look up from his data slate. Caring doesn't save them. It only destroys you. In 4 more years of this service, at current casualty rates, you will have processed approximately 12,000 deaths. You cannot maintain individual recognition for 12,000 people. Your psychology will fail before you reach half that number. So, I should just stop caring, just become a machine that tallies numbers and moves on. Yes, like you, because I'm still functional and you're collapsing. He set down his data slate with careful precision. I'd rather collapse than lose what makes me human. You won't have a choice. The ship will take it from you whether you're willing or not. I'm trying to make the process less painful. By teaching me to stop caring. By teaching you to survive. Constantine looked at me for duration of 11 seconds. Then he said very quietly, "I think you've forgotten the difference." He left to sleep in his quarters. I completed the casualty reports using my efficient method. Each name extracted as data point, each death logged as statistical reduction in crew complement. I processed 403 casualties in 47 minutes. Constantine had needed 8 hours to process less than 200 before I interrupted him. My method was superior by every objective measure. I sat alone in supply coordination, surrounded by names I had not read, and tried to remember when that had stopped bothering me. The third translation came 30 days later. We had received new crew, 212 replacements for accumulated losses. They were young, frightened. They asked questions that veterans had stopped asking. Will the field hold? What happens if it doesn't? How many usually die? The veterans told them acceptable lies. The field almost always holds. Failures are rare. Most translations complete without incident. These were statistically inaccurate statements, but psychologically necessary. The truth, that casualty was inevitable over enough translations, that everyone would either die or watch most of their cohort die. This truth helped no one. Constantine tried to prepare the new crew. He distributed emergency supply locations. He explained response protocols. He told them to remain sealed in quarters no matter what they heard outside. He told them not to look at reflective surfaces during translations. He told them true things that might help them survive. I watched him invest this effort and knew it would not matter. Some of the 212 would die in this translation, or the next, or the one after that. Constantine could not prevent this. His protocols might save a few, might save none. The ship would consume its percentage regardless. But he tried anyway. This was what made him Constantine. This was what made him matter. The third translation began at 0400 hours. I sealed myself in my quarters, senior officer quarters now, larger space, sane fundamental isolation, and waited. The familiar shudder. The sensation of wrongness as real space gave way to warp space. I gripped my bunk and counted seconds. At 8 seconds, the lights shifted to red. At 9 seconds, the temperature dropped. At 10 seconds, I heard the screaming begin. This was longer than the previous zone mortis failures. This was approaching the duration of the original incident that had killed Davros. I counted seconds and ran probability calculations and tried not to think about which section Constantine's quarters occupied and whether that section was experiencing manifestation. At 14 seconds, something hit my door. Not scratching this time. Impact, as though something large had struck the reinforced metal with significant force. The door held. Another impact. I heard metal deforming. I drew my last pistol. I always kept it charged now. Always kept it within reach. And aimed at the door while my hands remained steady and my heart rate elevated to 130 beats per minute, and my breathing stayed controlled because I had done this before and I would do it again. And adaptation was survival. At 19 seconds, the impacts stopped. At 21 seconds, I heard Constantine's voice. It came from everywhere. From the walls, from the deck plating, from inside my own skull. His voice, but wrong. Wrong in the way Davros's voice had been wrong when something else used it as instrument. Matthias, I understand now. I see it now. The numbers were people, but the people are just numbers, just mathematics, just probability distribution across infinite calculation. We're all just variables in equations we can't read. It's beautiful, Matthias. Come see. Come look. I want to show you how beautiful it is. I did not respond. I knew this was not Constantine. This was something using his voice. This was something that had found him, had taken him, had learned enough about him to weaponize his speech patterns against people who cared about him. This meant Constantine was dead. This meant Constantine was worse than dead. This meant something had consumed him and was wearing him like costume while it searched for others to consume. I'm outside your door, Matthias. I've been trying to get in. I just want to talk. I just want to show you what I've learned. The ship is alive, Matthias. It's been alive the whole time. It feeds on us. Every translation it opens its mouth, and we feed it our souls, and it loves us for it. It loves us so much. Can you feel how much it loves us? The voice continued speaking, but I stopped processing the words. I focused on counting seconds, on maintaining weapon aim, on breathing, on surviving the next moment, and then the next one. At 26 seconds, the Gellar field restored. The temperature rose. The red lighting flickered back to white. The voice stopped mid-sentence. Silence crashed down with weight that hurt my ears. I stood in my quarters, aiming a last pistol at my door for duration of 6 minutes, before my hands stopped shaking enough to lower the weapon. The Vox system activated. Commissar Voight again. His voice carried the same absolute authority, but underneath it I detected strain that had not been present in previous announcements. All personnel. Gellar field restored. Remain in quarters. Security sweeps in progress. 26-second failure duration. Heavy casualties anticipated. Remain sealed. Do not open doors for any reason, including for personnel claiming to be sweep teams. Authorized teams will carry proper identification codes. All others are to be considered hostile regardless of appearance. 26 seconds. More than 3 times the original incident. More than twice the longest zone mortis failure we had experienced. I ran the calculations. 26 seconds at estimated casualty rate of 50 per second. 1,300 dead. 16% of ship complement. This assumed linear scaling, which was not accurate. Longer failures produced exponentially increased casualties, as daemons had more time to spread and manifest in multiple sections. Estimated revised casualty count, between 1,500 and 2,000. Constantine's section had been on third deck, zone of heaviest manifestation during the original incident. High probability of casualty. I accessed crew roster and located his tracking beacon. Every crew member carried subcutaneous identification chip that transmitted location when queried by authorized personnel. Constantine's beacon showed active. He was in Corridor 7 Beta, third deck. Moving. He was alive. He was mobile. This meant either he had survived uncompromised, or something was moving his body, or something was wearing his body like vehicle. I should have remained in quarters. Protocol required it. Commissar Voigt had ordered it. Violating direct orders during emergency situation carried summary execution as authorized response. I unsealed my door and entered the corridor. The lighting was active but flickering at irregular intervals. The air smelled like copper and ozone, and something underneath that, something organic and wrong that my brain refused to fully process. The walls showed scorch marks and las burns. Someone had fought here. Someone had died here. The blood patterns on the deck suggested body had been dragged away, but whether by recovery teams or something else, I could not determine. I moved toward third deck, using service corridors that were less traveled. I encountered no one. I should have encountered security sweeps by now. The absence of activity suggested either the sweeps had not reached this section, or there was nothing left here to sweep. I reached third deck and accessed Corridor 7 Beta. Constantine was there. He stood in the center of the corridor facing away from me. His posture was wrong. His spine curved in angle that human anatomy should not permit. His arms hung at his sides, but the elbows bent backward slightly. He was humming. The tune was something I did not recognize, something that hurt to hear, something that made my teeth ache and my vision blur at the edges. "Constantine," I said. He stopped humming. He turned to face me, and the rotation was wrong, was too smooth, was like watching a statue pivot on a base rather than a human turning. His face was undamaged. His features were exactly as I remembered them. His expression showed happiness. Genuine, absolute, transcendent happiness. The kind of joy that should accompany profound revelation or religious ecstasy or reuniting with loved ones after years of separation. He looked at me with that expression, and I knew immediately that Constantine was not present behind those eyes. "Matthias," he said, and his voice was exactly right, was perfect reproduction of his speech patterns and tone and accent. "You came out of your quarters. That was stupid. That was against protocol. You could be executed for that. I was concerned for your safety." "My safety," he laughed. The sound was Constantine's laugh, but the rhythm was wrong, held too long, repeated too many times. "I've never been safer. I've never been more protected. I understand everything now. All the questions I had, all the patterns I couldn't see. They're all clear now. The numbers make sense. What happened to you?" I learned. He took a step toward me, and his leg bent in too many places. During the failure, something came into my quarters, something that wanted to teach me. I was so afraid at first, but then it showed me. It showed me what the ship really is, what we really are. We're not crew members, Matthias. We're fuel. We're offerings. The ship feeds us to the warp, and the warp feeds the ship, and the whole Imperium is just this same cycle repeated across 1,000,000 worlds. We're cattle that learn to pray while we're being slaughtered. That's not Constantine speaking. It's absolutely Constantine speaking. It's just that Constantine understands more now. Constantine saw the mathematics written in realms beyond physics. Constantine learned that caring about individuals was always stupid because individuals don't exist. We're just temporary formations of matter experiencing brief consciousness before dissolving back into the great equation. He took another step closer. "I tried to tell you before. I tried to make you understand that the numbers were people, but I was wrong. The people are numbers. That's the truth. That's the beautiful, horrible truth. I raised my last pistol, aimed at center mass. Stop moving. You're going to shoot me. I'm going to shoot whatever is using you. I'm not being used. I'm finally being honest. This is the most authentic I've ever been. His smile widened. His teeth looked normal, but there were too many of them, or they were arranged wrong, or my perception was failing. You taught me to adapt, Matthias. You taught me to survive by becoming less human. I just accelerated the process. I adapted completely. I survived by dying. Isn't that what you wanted? No. Liar. You wanted me to stop caring about casualties. You wanted me to stop seeing people in the numbers. Well, I stopped. I see the truth now. We're all just casualties waiting to be counted. The only difference is timing. He was within 3 meters now, close enough that I could see his eyes, and in his eyes I saw something looking back at me that was not Constantine and had never been Constantine. Something vast and ancient, and amused by this entire interaction. Last warning, I said. Stop moving or I fire. Fire then. Add me to the casualty report. Use your efficient method. Don't waste time reading my name. Just log me as number 643 or whatever I am in the tally. That's all I ever was. That's all any of us are. He lunged. I fired. The last bolt caught him in the chest. Superheated energy punched through tissue and bone and cauterized as it penetrated. He should have fallen. Basic physics and biology demanded it. But he continued moving, continued lunging, continued reaching for me with hands that were growing additional fingers even as I watched. I fired again, headshot. The bolt vaporized his right eye and a significant portion of skull behind it. He staggered but did not fall. His remaining eye fixed on me, and the expression was still smiling, still joyful, still completely wrong. It doesn't hurt, he said through a mouth that should not be capable of speech with that much head trauma. Nothing hurts anymore. That's what you wanted, isn't it? You wanted me to stop feeling pain. I stopped feeling everything. This is what adaptation looks like, Matthias. This is what survival requires. I fired 7 more shots. I emptied my power cell into the thing wearing Constantine's body. Last bolts burnt holes through chest, through abdomen, through limbs. The smell of cooked meat filled the corridor. The body collapsed finally, but the collapse was wrong, was like watching something with no skeletal structure deflate, rather than a human falling. The corpse lay on the deck, plating still smiling. I stood over it and tried to process what I had done. I had shot Constantine. I had killed him. The thing had not been him, had been something else wearing him. But the body was his. The face was his. The blood spreading across the deck was his. I had killed the only person aboard this ship who still saw people instead of numbers. I heard footsteps behind me. Multiple personnel moving information. I turned to see an armsman's squad approaching with weapons raised. Commissar Voigt leading them. He assessed the scene with single glance. Me standing over a corpse, last pistol depleted, corridor showing evidence of sustained combat. Supply Officer 2nd Class Kane, Voigt said. Report. I reported. Tracked Constantine's beacon to this location. Found him compromised. Attempted communication. Entity used his body as attack vector. Neutralized the threat. 13 shots to bring him down. This last detail felt important to document. It had taken 13 shots to stop something that should have been stopped by 1. Voigt examined the corpse. His expression showed no reaction. Crewman was registered on roster as Constantine Mir, clerk 3rd class, supply coordination, correct? Correct. We worked the same shifts. Personal connection? I hesitated. Personal connections were not strictly forbidden, but they complicated loyalty assessments. Admitting to attachment could trigger additional scrutiny. But lying to a commissar was a fatal mistake. He was someone I spoke to, I said. someone whose work I respected, someone who still cared about the right things. Voight studied me for duration that felt much longer than the actual 4 seconds that elapsed. You violated protocol by leaving your quarters during emergency situation. You engaged compromised personnel without authorization. Both actions carry summary execution as permissible response. Yes, sir. However, you successfully neutralized a demon-infected target and prevented its potential spread to other sections. This demonstrates initiative and loyalty to ship security. He holstered his bolt pistol. You are reprimanded for protocol violation. Formal notation will be entered in your service record. You are commended for hostile engagement and successful kill. These balance to net neutral assessment. You are dismissed to quarters. I was being allowed to live. I had broken direct orders and the punishment was administrative notation. This should have felt like mercy. It felt like nothing. The body, I asked, will be processed according to standard containment protocol. We've recovered 638 casualties so far. Estimates suggest 200 more remain unaccounted for in sealed or damaged sections. Your target is now logged as casualty 639. Voight gestured to his armsmen. Remove it. The armsmen retrieved the corpse. They handled it with professional detachment, securing it in containment shroud and loading it onto transport gurney. Constantine's face remained visible for several seconds before they sealed the shroud. The expression had finally changed. He no longer smiled. He looked empty. I returned to my quarters. I sealed the door and sat on my bunk and tried to feel something about what had happened. I had killed Constantine. I had shot him 13 times. I had watched something use his body and voice and knowledge of me as weapons. I had seen what the warp did to people who tried to maintain their humanity in an environment designed to strip it away. Constantine had wanted to remain human, had wanted to see people in the numbers, had believed his caring mattered. The warp had shown him the truth, that caring was vulnerability, that attachment was wound waiting to be exploited, that everything I had tried to teach him about adaptation had been correct, and I had killed him for learning the lesson. I sat in my quarters for 6 hours attempting to process grief and finding only hollow space where the emotion should have been. I had cared about Constantine. Past tense. Care was archived now, filed as historical data, marked as completed process. He had been alive. Now he was casualty 639. This was the only truth that remained. I tried to cry and could not. The capacity had been deleted from my active processes somewhere between Translation 7 and Translation 15. Deleted along with my name and my mother's face and everything else that had made me Matthias Kane instead of Supply Officer, second-class position designation. Constantine had been right. I had forgotten the difference between surviving and living. I had survived. He had lived. The ship had killed him for it and used his corpse as weapon against me. This was how the Imperium functioned. This was acceptable loss parameter. The casualty count from the third zone Mortis translation reached 871, 10.8% of ship complement. We received 400 replacement crew 30 days later. They were young and frightened, and they asked the same questions that every replacement cohort asked. The veterans told them the same lies. I processed the supply requisitions for their integration. Rations, uniforms, basic equipment, quarters assignments. I logged each one as number without reading names. This was efficient. This was correct procedure. This was how you survived. I trained their supply coordination replacements, 3 new clerks to fill positions vacated by casualties. I taught them efficient methods for casualty processing. I taught them not to read names. I taught them to see numbers instead of people, because that was what I knew how to teach now. None of them were Constantine. None of them asked questions that mattered. None of them looked at the supply reports and saw human cost behind the figures. They were adequate. They performed their functions. They would survive or they would become casualties, and I would train their replacements. We conducted 6 more translations over the following year. Cumulative casualties, 1,204. I processed every report using my efficient method. The names meant nothing. The causes of death meant nothing. The numbers accumulated in my logs, and I moved forward because moving forward was the only available direction. I began noticing gaps in my memory, not dysfunction, optimization. My mind had started automatically archiving non-essential data to conserve processing capacity. I could not remember what I had eaten 3 days ago. I could not remember the last time I had spoken to someone about something other than duty requirements. I could not remember the specific sound of Constantine's voice when he told me about his mother, only that the conversation had occurred, and I had filed it as significant at the time. The data was fragmenting. I was becoming more efficient as I became less complete. This was adaptation. This was survival. This was what I had tried to teach him. 5 years after Constantine's death, I was promoted to Supply Officer First Class, senior department position, expanded authority, direct access to command-level logistics coordination. I accepted the promotion without emotional response. It was logical progression based on performance and survival duration, nothing more. 10 years after Constantine's death, I had processed 47,000 casualties across routine reports and incident documentation. 47,000 names that I had extracted as data points without reading. 47,000 people who had been numbers before they died and remained numbers after. This was correct. This was how it had to be. I tried sometimes to remember why I had thought Constantine mattered. I could access the factual data. He had worked in my department. He had asked intelligent questions. I had invested emotional attachment. But the feeling that had accompanied that attachment, the warmth of caring about someone, the fear of losing them, the grief when they were gone, these were archived in corrupted files that I could not fully access. I had survived by forgetting how to care. Constantine had been right. I had forgotten the difference. 18 years after I had watched Davros die through a data slate screen. 26 years after I had been conscripted at age 17. I found myself alone in supply coordination during third shift rotation when maintenance teams shut down auxiliary power to perform required repairs. The chamber went dark. Emergency lighting failed to activate, some malfunction in the backup systems that maintenance would correct eventually. I sat in absolute darkness, surrounded by inactive data slates and silent machinery, and for the first time in decades I had no duty to perform, no report to process, no function to execute. Just darkness, just silence, just consciousness without input. I counted seconds and waited for the lights to restore, and discovered that I had forgotten how to be alone with myself. In the darkness, I tried to remember my mother's face. The file was corrupted beyond recovery. Brown hair and scar tissue were all that remained, physical descriptors without attached memory. I tried to remember Davros before he died. I retrieved fragments. His accent, his habit of checking supply counts twice, the fact that he had been my superior officer. The person underneath those facts was gone. I tried to remember Constantine. This file was more complete because it was more recent, but it was degrading. I could remember that he had mattered. I could remember teaching him, talking to him, caring about him. But I could not reconstruct the specific feeling of his presence, could not remember the exact pattern of our conversations, could not access the grief I should have felt when I shot him 13 times and watched him fall. I was losing the memories that made loss meaningful. I was becoming archive without context, database without user, function without purpose. The darkness continued. I sat in it and counted seconds and realized that this was practice for what I would eventually become. This was the end point of adaptation. Perfect efficiency through complete erasure. I would continue processing reports and training replacements and surviving translations until the ship consumed me or I degraded beyond repair. And when I died, if I died rather than being reclaimed as servitor or component, what would remain? Service records, logistics reports, casual documentation. 47,000 names that I had processed without reading. A notation that Supply Officer First Class designation had been vacated and required replacement. I would be a number in someone else's efficient report. This was appropriate. This was what I had become. The lights restored after 23 minutes. The data slates activated. My eyes adjusted to the sudden illumination. I resumed my duties without pause. There were requisitions to process and reports to file, and none of it mattered and all of it continued, and I was part of the mechanism that made it continue. This was survival. This was adaptation. This was what the Imperium required. I am currently Supply Officer First Class aboard the Undying Conviction. 43 years of service, 59 translations survived. I have processed an estimated 94,000 casualties across my tenure. The ship maintains crew complement of 8,000 through continuous replacement. We are currently undermanned by 314 positions following our most recent translation. Replacement crew will arrive at our next port call in 47 days. I no longer remember my mother's name. I no longer remember Davros's face with any clarity. Constantine exists in my archive as important but degraded file that I reference occasionally without being able to reconstruct the significance he once held. I eat when duty schedule permits. I sleep when exhaustion forces cessation of function. I process reports with maximum efficiency. I have trained 53 replacements. 19 of them are still alive. The others became numbers in my reports. I do not fear warp translations anymore. Fear requires investment in outcome. I have no investments. I exist as function within system that consumes people and produces continuation. I am very good at my function. This is why I survive. Sometimes during warp translations, when I am sealed in my quarters waiting to discover if the Gellar field holds, I think about Constantine's final words, the ones the demon spoke using his voice. That we are cattle that learn to pray while being slaughtered. That people are just numbers. That caring about individuals was always stupid because individuals don't exist. I think the demon was correct, or perhaps Constantine had been correct before the demon took him. Perhaps his mother had been correct when she told him every number represents someone. Perhaps all of these perspectives are equally true, depending on how much humanity you have left to process the question. I am no longer qualified to answer. I am process without perspective. I am function without feeling. I am the inevitable result of adaptation taken to its logical conclusion. The ship continues. The translations continue. The casualties accumulate. I process the reports and train the replacements, and survive by being less human than the person I replaced, and more human than the servitors that will eventually reclaim my remains when I fail to report for duty. This is what the Imperium costs. Not just lives, though lives are consumed in mathematically predictable quantities, but the degradation of everyone who survives. We pay for continuation by eroding everything that made us worth continuing. We adapt by forgetting why we wanted to survive in the first place. Constantine tried to remember. The ship killed him for it. I forgot. The ship keeps me. This is the only difference. This is acceptable loss parameter. This is how 8.3 seconds of Gellar field failure kills 600 souls from a crew of 8,000, and everyone agrees this is standard risk, happens regularly. Most ships lose someone every transit. We lose more than someone. We lose everyone. Just slowly. Just across enough translations that the degradation seems like adaptation rather than death. I have forgotten the difference. I will file this testimony in my personal archive and continue my duties. There are requisitions to process. There are replacements to train. There are casualties to count without reading their names. The numbers accumulate. The ship continues. I continue because I have forgotten how to do anything else. This is efficiency. This is survival. This is what remains when you adapt completely to hell. My name was Matthias Kane. I was 17 when I left my home world. My mother had a scar on her left cheekbone. I remember these facts because I documented them deliberately before the files corrupted completely. Everything else is archived now. Everything else is process. I exist to serve the ship that consumes me. This is correct. This is proper. This is the only truth that survives translation. The Emperor protects, they tell us. I have processed 94,000 casualties. I am still waiting for protection.